The epic battle at Tarawa in November 1943 brought home to the American public the cost of the war against Japan. Though Tarawa had been won at a great price, the lessons learned there were to prevent the loss of other thousands of American fighting men in battles on other Pacific islands. In January 1944, an invasion of the Marshall Islands was undertaken. An invasion whose success depended in large measure on the experience gained at Tarawa. In the Central Pacific, the Marshall Islands constituted a block in the path of the U.S. drive westward. If that drive was to be successful, several strategically located islands in that group must be seized. In Hawaii, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, and everyone in his command were vitally concerned with the preparations for the forthcoming assault on the Marshalls. For the Central Pacific Offensive, begun so auspiciously with the victories in the Gilbert Islands at Makin and Tarawa, depended for its success on a quick follow-up. The planned invasion of atolls in the next major island chain, the Marshalls, was to be followed by further assaults on islands still far to westward, in a giant island-hopping operation, which would take American fighting forces to the very doorstep of Japan itself. In January 1944, the High Command in the Central Pacific Theater checked carefully over final preparations for the all-important invasion of the Marshalls. The amphibious assault force left Hawaii behind and headed for the Marshalls in late January. Stealthily, the fleet moved into enemy waters. Gunners in the mightiest invasion fleet yet mounted prepared to knock out enemy defenses on the target islands. This time they planned to see to it that no one could possibly consider the naval shelling too light. On January 29th, the warships began their softening up of Kwajalein Atoll. For weeks, liberators of the 7th Air Force pounded the atolls in the eastern and central Marshalls. At Kwajalein, the world's largest coral atoll, the main objectives were 3 small islands. Roy and Namur, linked by an artificial causeway, were to be seized by the 4th Marine Division. En route to the invasion of the islands, Marine officers familiarized the men with all available details of their objective, their size, shape, and defenses. At Kwajalein Atoll, the 4th Marine Division went into action for the first time. Most of the men had arrived only recently from Marine training camps in the United States. For the first time, the assault waves took their own supplies with them. H-hour, delayed almost 2 hours, was only minutes away. The men would be real veterans soon. Waves of Marines neared the landing beaches, the carrier pilots gave the enemy a last-minute once-over. The men men were prepared for another Tarawa. American troops were storming the first piece of pre-war Japanese territory. And from all indications, the enemy planned to hold on to it. The 4th Division Marines were loaded for action. They were prepared for the worst. It was tough on the beach, but it was no Tarawa. Although enemy resistance was lighter than expected, the battle was no pushover. The area was still far from secure. The troops at Kwajalein benefited enormously from the experience other American fighting men had had on similar atolls in the Gilberts some 2 months before. The pattern for dealing with a dug-in enemy on a tiny sand spit of an island had been successfully established. The Marines took every precaution in dealing with the fanatical defenders of Roy and Namur. The Marines took some prisoners at Roy and Namur, but they represented only a small percentage of the enemy force which defended the island. 264 Japanese were captured on the 2 islands. But there were still many pockets of enemy resistance. On Roy, the principal objective was the enemy airfield. Taking it was no simple task. During the afternoon, the battle raged on. By late afternoon, the back of enemy resistance on Roy was broken. This time, the naval and air bombardment had achieved some notable results. The airfield on Roy was seized on D-Day afternoon. The strips had constituted an important launching platform for enemy planes. A number of the Japanese planes had been in no condition to leave the island before it fell. Namur was wrested from the enemy by the early afternoon of the 2nd day. On that island, too, the sturdy Japanese blockhouses had proved unable to withstand the U.S. bombardment. The enemy defenses were a favorite subject for combat artists, who sometimes accompanied the assault troops on Pacific invasions. The blockhouses proved equally fascinating to every Marine on the island. The enemy high command had ordered Roy and Namur defended to the last man. Marine General Holland Smith, in command of the ground forces and the marshals, was well pleased with the performance of the untested 4th Marine Division. The general was favorably impressed, too, with the job the Navy warships had done. In other operations, he was not usually satisfied with the Navy's bombardment. But at Kwajalein, he felt they had done well by his amphibious forces. The Japanese who garrisoned Roy and Namur hadn't believed it possible for their stronghold to fall to an American overwater assault. After the battle, the Marines had an opportunity to inspect the souvenirs they'd collected. The most highly prized memento throughout the Pacific was a Japanese samurai sword, usually carried only by high-ranking enemy officers. There was plenty of Japanese money for the invaders, but no place to spend it. The men who'd made the assault hadn't had a chance to take their shoes off since leaving the transports for the invasion. They almost felt civilized again. With the battle won, U.S. forces had reached another milestone on the road to Tokyo. Many of the men who had helped achieve that forward step had been cut down during the battle. In all cases possible, positive identification of the dead was sought by the Graves Registration Section of the 4th Marine Division. Casualties were light compared with the figures of American losses on Tarawa. But 190 Marines lost their lives at Roy and Namur in the struggle to establish a foothold for U.S. forces in the Marshalls. Each new victory in the drive across the Pacific was marked by still another burial service and the dedication of another square of hallowed ground, thousands of miles from home. The men who survived felt a very real sense of loss, for a strong feeling of kinship springs up between men in battle for a common cause. The dead would not be forgotten by the men who had fought with them side by side. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army's 7th Division was occupied with the enemy on the southernmost island of Kwajalein Atoll. On February 1st, in mid-morning, the assault waves moved into the beach. These GIs had last seen action in the Aleutians in quite a different setting. World War II was the first major war to be thoroughly covered by combat cameramen. To record the war on film, motion picture cameramen went ashore with the first waves of assault troops and stayed with them in the thick of the fight. The 7th Division GIs pushed across the island against spotty enemy opposition. On that first day on Kwajalein, U.S. casualties were light. Less than 70 men were hit by enemy fire. With the tanks pacing the advance, the GIs took the island yard by yard. The soldiers pressed the attack in the face of stiffening enemy resistance. Tanks played a major role in the victories in the Marshalls, but it was still the men with the rifles who seized and held the territory. On Kwajalein Islet, the coordination of tanks and infantry operating together had still not been perfected. But the advance was well executed. It was no easy job to overwhelm all the enemy troops on the island. For 5 days, the 7th Division GIs battled the enemy on Kwajalein. And for 5 days, the enemy had to be located and blasted out of his hold. More enemy soldiers were being knocked out of the battle by the determined GIs. Enemy casualties mounted steadily. The weary GIs continued the attack against a well-entrenched enemy. As on Roy and Namur to the north, the Japanese garrison on Kwajalein Islet had solid positions from which to carry on their stubborn defense of the island. In the process of seizing the islet from the enemy, 1,214 American soldiers were hit on Kwajalein. The lightness of American casualties could be traced to the more careful preparation on the part of both the Army and Navy. On February 5th, the battle on Kwajalein Islet had been won. After the spirited struggle, 170 enemy troops were taken prisoner, all that was left of a garrison force of some 4,000. The enemy had lost the 3 key islands of one of the most strategic atolls in the Central Pacific. The defeated troops were beginning to have a few doubts about the invincibility of the Japanese war machine. In February 1944, U.S. forces pushed deeper into enemy territory, to the extreme western end of the Marshall Islands chain. Eniwetok Atoll was invaded in mid-February by 2 regiments, 1 Marine, 1 Army. The 22nd Marine Regiment landed first on Njebe Islet, and in a furious day-long battle knocked out a strong enemy garrison. The Marines on Njebe were seeing action for the first time, and they acquitted themselves well. Tanks were used to good advantage in the Marine assault on Njebe. The 3 principal islets of Eniwetok Atoll were successfully seized by the 5 battalions of Marines and soldiers in 7 days. On Eniwetok Islet, U.S. soldiers and Marines choked off enemy resistance, but not without suffering some losses. Many of the casualties among the riflemen were attributable to the light bombardment of this particular islet. On Parry Islet, 22nd Regiment Marines fought almost a duplicate of their earlier battle on Njebe, except that the enemy on Parry held out a bit more stubbornly. But the Marines mopped it up on the second day. During the final stages of the fight to seize the major islands of Eniwetok Atoll, work on the airstrips was being carried forward, often under enemy fire, by the hard-working members of a Navy service known as the Seabees. Organized early in World War II, the Navy's construction battalions achieved miracles in building airstrips on islands all across the Pacific in unbelievably short periods of time and under any conditions. The Seabees never wasted any time. The job was always done the quickest possible way. And the Seabees never lost an opportunity to take advantage of whatever came their way, including enemy equipment. On Eniwetok Atoll, a strip capable of accommodating 4 squadrons of fighters was hurriedly finished. The speed with which the Seabees could build an airstrip on any kind of terrain was a constant source of wonder to the fighting men in the area. Even the Army was impressed with the Seabees' accomplishments in the Pacific. The work of the construction battalions on islands all across the Pacific was greatly admired by the Marine Corps, charged with seizing and holding those bases. The Seabees' most vital functions included the construction and repair of airstrips, of coral and sand. For on the speed with which those airstrips were put into operation depended the speed of the continuing advance toward Japan. The majority of the 250,000 men in the Seabees had had experience in some phase of construction work before entering the service. That experience proved invaluable to the U.S. fighting forces. But even the most knowledgeable construction men were faced with many completely new problems on the islands of the Pacific. Once their job was done, the Seabees never had long to wait to see the results of their work. Windmill washing machines became familiar sights on the islands where the Seabees were on the job. Just one evidence of the versatility of the Navy's newest branch. But aids to comfortable living in the tropics were only spare time projects. After the airstrips were built or repaired on an island base, the Seabees fell to work on the construction of the necessary buildings for the forces which would garrison the new base. The job of creating a camp the size of a small city was usually only a few weeks' work for a battalion of Seabees. Their favorite boast, "We do the difficult immediately, the impossible takes a little longer," was not considered an overstatement by the troops in the Pacific. The housing of the fighting men was only one of the Seabees' responsibilities. One of the impossible jobs they performed was providing ice at tropical Pacific bases. Whatever the need, the Seabees could be counted on to fill it, and without delay. Their philosophy was summed up in a standard two-word answer to any request: can do. The U.S. now had possession of two key atolls in the Marshalls Group. Those two quick victories on a few sandy islands made a considerable difference in the areas of control exercised by the two principal warring powers in the Pacific. For from the Marshalls, the U.S. Air Force was in excellent position to launch attacks against the Caroline Islands, and in particular the enemy's powerful base at Truk. From Kwajalein in mid-March, 7th Air Force bombers began a series of strikes against that enemy stronghold. The Liberators could make the trip from Kwajalein to Truk and return in less than 9 hours, if the weather was favorable for that period. The 7th Air Force planes were reinforced by bombers of the 13th Air Force operating from South Pacific bases. The target, the group of islands called Truk, was the most important enemy staging area between Japan and the Southwest Pacific. The legend of Truk's invincibility was about to be punctured effectively. The Liberators were depositing the new 2,000-pound bombs on the enemy's base. The attacks were highly successful. In less than 4 months, once mighty Truk was to become virtually useless to the enemy. In a single month in early 1944, U.S. Air Force planes dropped a total of 1,813 tons of bombs on Truk. The enemy's stronghold was reduced to a mere shell. In the Southwest Pacific, as 1943 turned into 44, the U.S. fighting forces centered their attention on the Bismarck Archipelago and the northern coast of New Guinea, the road which led back to the Philippines.